Yes. Well, that one really arose out of another book you've got in the pile there, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World.
That's right, yes.
What happened was that I found that the trying to change the way biology is done was not very easy, because most biologists were convinced in the 80s and 90s that all the answers would come from gene sequencing, the Genome Project, molecular biology, and so forth. The more holistic approach I was advocating didn't go down too well among many of my colleagues. And it was very difficult to get grants to do the kind of research I thought was interesting. So what I did was came up with the idea of very simple experiments that wouldn't cost much, that could change our view of reality. And that book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, subtitled A Do-It-Yourself Guide to Revolutionary Science, was an attempt to see how very simple experiments could change our view of things. They weren't all to do with morphic resonance, but they were all to do with opening up our view of reality.
Just explain one experiment in there so people can get the feel of what it contains.
Well, 2 of them I could explain because they led to 2 of my later books. The first one was on dogs that know when their owners are coming home. I found that a lot of people had pets that knew when a member of the family was coming home. I first heard about this from a neighbour of mine in Newark. And she was a widow whose son was a merchant seaman. And she told me that when her son was coming home, he never rang to tell her because he didn't want her to worry if he was delayed. But she always knew when his ship was getting into Southampton because his cat would go and sit at the front door and look very excited. And so when that happened, she knew that her son wouldn't be more than a few hours before he got home on the train. So she went out and bought extra food and got the favourite things he liked, so that when he got home, she could make him tea or breakfast or whenever he arrived that was with his favourite foods. And she always knew because the cat told her by going and waiting at the door. Well, I just didn't know whether to believe this or not. And I mentioned it to somebody and they said, "Oh, our dog does that." And I mentioned it to someone else and said, "Oh, yes, our dog knows when my husband's coming home." And I then started asking my family and friends, and I came across hundreds of stories like this. I appealed for information through newspapers and on the radio, and soon I was inundated with stories of dogs that did this. Now, that became one of the experiments I wrote about in the book. I hadn't actually done the experiment at that stage, but I was proposing it. The idea is, if a dog or a cat knows when someone's coming home and goes and waits at the door or the window, this is visible behaviour. You can film it. This is an objective pattern of behaviour. The Skeptics said to me, "Oh, well, it's just people projecting this onto their pets. It's wishful thinking. They're not really doing it. It's just a coincidence," and so forth. Or the Skeptics said, "Well, if it does happen, it's just a routine, or it's just a matter of the person at home knowing when they're coming and the animal picks it up from them." I knew from these stories that wasn't true, because this woman with the son who was the merchant seaman, it wasn't a routine when he came home, and the animal didn't pick it up from her, she picked it up from the animal. So these skeptical arguments didn't really make sense. Oh, and then they said it's just familiar car sounds that the animal can hear from many miles away. Well, again, that wouldn't fit with a merchant seaman coming home by train from Southampton to Nottinghamshire. So I felt there must be more going on than that. And so the basic experiment I propose in the book is that the person goes out at least 5 miles away. The place the animal waits is filmed continuously, so there's a continuous objective record. And the person comes home at a random time, and they come home in a taxi to avoid familiar car sounds. And I've now done lots of those experiments, and some dogs get it right over and over and over again. You can film it. They never get tired of their owner coming home. It's a perfectly repeatable experiment. And this led me into a whole area of research with dogs, cats, parrots, and other animals, horses, which I wrote up in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals. The reason I think that's relevant to my work on morphic fields is that I think that when there's a social bond between a person and a person, or a person and an animal, there's a kind of field that links them, an example of a morphic field. Now, when they go apart, when the person goes away and leaves the dog at home, that field stretches like an invisible elastic band, but they're still connected. And when the person decides to come home, that change in intention can affect the dog, so the dog knows they're coming and goes and waits at the door. So I think there's a perfectly rational scientific explanation for this telepathic ability. What my experiment showed is that it can't be explained by normal causes like sounds and hearing the car and that kind of thing, or routine. It does seem to be telepathic. And so that's one of the experiments I proposed in 7 experiments that could change the world. It's been borne out by a great deal of evidence. Even skeptics have replicated this effect rather unwillingly. And so I think it's now clear that animals can do this. It hasn't quite changed the world yet, this realization, but what it's made a lot of people realize is that the behavior they see in their pets, or that members of their family notice with animals, can't just be dismissed as an illusion. It's in many cases real, and it's showing that all over the world there are hundreds of millions of households where this kind of thing is going on a daily basis. It simply doesn't fit into the standard mechanistic view of science, but it does fit into an enlarged view of science where our minds and our intentions are not simply confined to the insides of our heads.
If we go back to what we talked about earlier about consciousness and science and how they were many years ago a long way apart, and now they seem to be coming more together in terms of more people recognising there has to be some kind of interrelation. It's interesting because these days we accept more that we are one entity. It was James Lovelock, I think I first read when he talked about the planet being one being. I hadn't really thought of that before. It really stimulated something in me. And now we read about it in many ways, about how there's this interconnectedness. We are all one being. We're all part of one thing. So if we look at it from that point of view, it makes sense in the so far as, I can say, if I tap my finger, there's chemical responses go on and I feel the tap in my brain and I know something's tapping my finger. Now, if we are all one body, if you like, then it's no doubt that something that happens outside of the planet is going to affect us all in a certain way. And it might be minute, and there's certain people can pick that up. I'm just thinking of throwing something else in the pot here for maybe a wider discussion. I think of my wife Renata, who has the power to leave her body and go, and she can see what's happening on the other side of the planet. Well, she doesn't do it so much now, but she used to. Or she can go in the next room and see what's happening. It's somehow, the picture becomes so much bigger.
Yes. Well, I agree. I think that the focus in science, for both a lot of, in physics and in biology, has been on trying to reduce things to their smallest parts. In the case of living things, molecules; in the case of physics, subatomic particles. And this has given us a kind of tunnel vision that ignores the bigger picture. Now, it's true in physics there's also cosmology, which looks at the whole universe, and that does give a big picture, a very big picture. But I think what James Lovelock did with the Gaia hypothesis was showed that this very reductionist science had simply ignored the fact that the Earth is a kind of living organism. What happens in one place affects things elsewhere. And that's, of course, why we've got climate change going on at the moment, and why that's such a big issue, because we all affect the climate, the atmosphere of the Earth, by what we do. People simply ignored that until at least the 1970s, when the earliest ecological thinkers like Edward Goldsmith started pointing out these things.
And some still try to ignore it.
Yes, some still try to ignore it or deny it.